I didn't reach out. Not because I was angry, and not because I no longer cared. I didn't reach out because the moment didn't clearly ask for it. There was no crisis, no urgency, no explicit signal that intervention was required. Everything appeared stable enough to continue without me. At the time, that felt like a reasonable assessment. Reaching out would have introduced a shift. It would have changed the balance of the situation. It would have required me to step into something that had already begun to settle on its own. So I stayed where I was. I didn't reach out because the absence of action felt neutral. Not reaching out didn't feel like a decision. It felt like allowing things to unfold naturally, like trusting the process rather than interfering with it. The space remained intact. No one asked where I was. No one reached out to me either, which reinforced the sense that my silence had landed where it was supposed to. I told myself that timing mattered, that reaching out too soon could feel intrusive. That waiting showed respect for boundaries that hadn't been articulated, but were implied. There's a kind of restraint that looks thoughtful from the outside. I believe that's what I was practicing. I didn't reach out, because doing so would have required explanation. Why now? Why this message? Why reopen something that seemed to have found its own resting point? Those questions felt heavier than the act of staying silent. Silence requires no justification. It doesn't interrupt. It doesn't need to be framed. It simply exists. So I let it. Days passed. Then more days. Nothing dramatic occurred. The situation didn't deteriorate. No obvious consequence emerged that suggested I had made a mistake, which made the choice easier to defend. If reaching out had been necessary, I thought, surely that necessity would have made itself known. But necessity doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits. I didn't reach out. And gradually, the possibility of doing so began to feel less available. Not impossible, just less natural. The longer the silence held, the more weight it accumulated. Reaching out later would have required acknowledging the gap, explaining the absence, accounting for the time that had passed. That explanation felt disproportionate to what I had originally withheld, so I continued not to reach out. This is how non-actions become patterns, not through intention, but through momentum. I began to notice how easily I justified the silence. They're busy. They don't need this. If it mattered, they would have reached out first. Each explanation felt plausible. Together, they formed a structure that supported inaction. I didn't reach out because the world didn't ask me to. Everything continued. Conversations happened elsewhere. Life filled the space, which made my absence feel inconsequential. But absence doesn't announce its impact. It doesn't draw attention to itself. It operates quietly, shaping what doesn't happen rather than what does. I noticed it later, not as regret, but as a subtle sense of distance. Not distance from a person, but from a version of myself who might have acted differently. The decision not to reach out had preserved stability, but it had also preserved separation. I didn't reach out because I believed that care didn't always require presence. That sometimes the most respectful thing was to let people be. And that belief wasn't entirely wrong, but it was incomplete. Care that never appears is difficult to distinguish from indifference. I realized then that reaching out isn't always about fixing something. Sometimes it's simply about signaling that you are still oriented toward the other person, that you are paying attention, that the line between you hasn't gone dormant. I hadn't sent that signal, not because I didn't want to, but because the moment didn't demand it loudly enough. I didn't reach out, and in doing so, I allowed the silence to define the relationship's current state, not intentionally, not consciously. But defaults are powerful. Once silence becomes the default, reaching out begins to feel like deviation, a break in pattern, a disruption, and disruptions require justification. I found myself calculating whether the reason to reach out was strong enough to outweigh the comfort of leaving things as they were. Often it didn't seem to be, so I stayed quiet. The irony is that reaching out rarely requires as much justification as we imagine, but imagination fills the gap. When action is delayed, I didn't reach out, and the silence grew familiar. Not comfortable, just familiar. It became part of the background, something I no longer actively noticed, but could still feel. I don't believe that every situation demands contact. I still don't. Some spaces need distance. Some moments resolve better, without interference. But I've learned that choosing not to reach out is still a choice, one that shapes how connections age. Silence doesn't freeze relationships. It lets them drift. I didn't reach out, and the world didn't react. No confrontation, no collapse, no clear ending, which is precisely why the choice mattered. Not because something went wrong, but because something quietly shifted. The opportunity to reach out didn't disappear immediately. It faded. And by the time I noticed that fading, it felt less like an option and more like a missed alignment. I didn't reach out because I believed that if it mattered, the moment would come back around. But moments don't always return. Sometimes they just pass, leaving behind a new configuration. That feels stable enough to accept. I didn't reach out, and that choice didn't announce itself as significant. Everything functioned. Life moved on, which is why it took time to understand what had happened. Not reaching out hadn't solved anything. It hadn't protected anything either. It had simply allowed the distance to become part of the structure. And structures once formed are harder to change than moments ever are. I didn't reach out. Not because I couldn't. Not because I didn't care. But because silence felt like the least disruptive option. Only later did I realize that least disruptive is not the same as least consequential.